Hello, carpentry community. As first-year apprentices, we need to know very well the table saw, the different parts of the table saw, how to operate the table saw safely, and knowing how to make adjustments with all of the accessories. So first of all, we're just going to walk through the table saw, identify the different parts of the table saw, as well as the accessories. First of all, the on-off switch. In this case here, make sure that you can identify the on-off switch and how to operate it. Besides that, if you were ever to make any changes to the blade, as I'm lifting up the blade guard, if you were to ever make any changes or touching the blade, you would always want to lock out the power. So the power lockout is usually close to where the intake power is, and in this case here, you can see that the power is turned off this way. Let's take a look at some of the parts of the table saw. Obviously, this is the blade. Behind the blade is called the splitter or riving knife. And looking closely on this model, you can see that there are anti-kickback fingers which are attached just above the last part, and this is the blade guard. These are the three safety components that should be in place when you are using a table saw. Let's look at some of the other parts. On this machine tabletop are machined miter grooves. There's two of them here. A little further along is the fence. You need to either have a fence or a miter gauge in order to operate this table saw. Let's take a look at the table here with some accessories. Very important that we use eye protection at all times when we're using a table saw. For narrow stock, that is stock that's less than 6 inches, you need to have a push stick. As I said before, a miter gauge, and we'll talk later about how you can set the 45 degree on the miter gauge. So a tape measure as well as a framing square. And then some accessories such as a dado set and a wide slot table insert. Looking at a couple of very important parts of the table saw for adjustment is the tilt hand wheel, which is actually right here. This is the tilt hand wheel, and this is the hand wheel that raises the blade. In the middle of both the tilt hand wheel and the height adjustment wheel has locks. So in order to operate the height adjustment, the lock must be removed or loosened, and as you can see, the blade is being raised. Alternately, turning counterclockwise, the blade can be lowered. Always remember to tighten the lock when you reach the safe height. Same with the tilt hand wheel. If you need to change the angle of the blade to create a bevel cut, you need to loosen the lock underneath in the center of the wheel and then crank it to your desired bevel angle. Keep in mind that if you are ever going to cut a bevel and rip a bevel on the table saw, you never want to tilt the blade toward the fence. You must always remember that you need to tilt the blade away from the fence when you are ripping a bevel. Let's talk about adjusting the fence. Whenever you are using the fence to rip a piece of stock on the table saw, you need to make sure that the fence is aligned perfectly parallel to the blade. Now on new table saws, and in this case a stationary cabinet table saw like this, these type of fences have an automatic lock that allow you to trust that it is parallel. But for a lot of times, the best way to check that this fence is parallel perfectly to the blade is to use a tape measure and to measure the distance to a mitered groove edge, front as well as back. As long as those two measurements are equal, you know that this fence is parallel to the blade. This is a miter gauge. And as you can see, the positive stops on the miter gauge is set to 45 degrees. In order for you to check and to double check that this stop is a true 45 degrees, you need to use a framing square, as you can see here, in order to make sure that this positive stop is set for 45 degrees. A lot of questions my apprentices have is, can I use the miter gauge to crosscut on the table saw? And the answer is no, unless you use a stop block. And this is why we do that. If you are going to crosscut using a miter gauge, and for the purpose of this, you can see that I've raised the blade guard so you can see. If you are cutting a crosscut with a miter gauge, you need to have a stop so that once you pass the stop to the correct distance you're cross-cutting, there is a clearance that will prevent any kickback. If you didn't have a stop and you push this right up against and proceeded to cut, the result will be a kickback, which could be quite dangerous for the operator. So again, if you are cross-cutting with a miter saw, with a miter gauge and a fence, you must have a stop, which is situated just before the blade. Whenever attempting to rip narrow stock or wood, always make sure, in this case here, that you have a push stick ready to use, okay? So narrow stock, anywhere that is 6 inches or less, you must always use a push stick. Also, when you rip stock or material, if there is material that is crooked, you increase the chances of kickback as well. So be aware of very crooked material, that's going to cause kickback. Let's talk about the proper height of your blade in relation to the stock you're cutting. Typically on thicker stock, 3/4 inch, 1/2 inch plus, your height of your blade must be no higher than 1/4 inch or to the bottom of the gullet for your blade. However, if you are going to rip narrow stock, stock that is quite thin, I should say, very thin stock may require you to raise the blade high enough so that when you are finished pushing this through, any adjustment or bending of this thin stock will not lose the height of the blade because of bending of the material. So on thin stock, remember to raise the blade enough so that your blade won't disappear through the cutting process. So I want to cut a piece of stock that is has a bevel. So I want to rip something with a bevel. What do you need to remember? Well, obviously, you need to go to the tilt hand wheel and adjust the angle to the appropriate degree that you want to cut. So remember, the tilt hand wheel, the tilting hand wheel is what's going to allow you to find the proper degree of bevel for that rip. Let's briefly talk about the blades themselves. I'm going to loosen the lock of the raising wheel. I'm going to bring it up. I'm going to make sure that, again, my power is locked off because I am going to touch the blade. And I just want to quickly mention, this would be considered a combination blade. Crosscut blades are the best blades to use if you're cutting a lot of plywood. Although this is a combination blade, just looking briefly and understanding the way teeth are filed, for a true rip blade to be called a rip blade, the teeth would be filed straight. That would resemble chisels. If this were a tapered or hollow ground blade, the one thing that it would not have would be set. Let's briefly talk about an accessory, and that is dado blades. Sometimes you need to cut a wide slot on a piece of material. One thing to remember, if you ever use a dado set, as this one here, these are the outside cutting blades. These are the chippers, variety assortment of widths, and you must always remember to have a wide table insert, whenever you are putting in a dado set. Another thing to remember is when you're aligning the chippers in between the inside and outside blades, always remember that the chipper teeth should line up in between the gullets, okay? Let's talk about a couple of measurements, adjustments to make sure a few things are correct. To truly make sure that our blade is cutting parallel, you can take a tape measure, hook onto a mitered groove, and pick one tooth. That's just one tooth. Typically you make a mark with a Sharpie. You want to measure the distance from a mitered groove edge to that one tooth, and then rotate that blade to the back, and then with the same tooth measure one more time to the mitered edge, and that will tell you if this blade is truly parallel to the fence. To make sure that you are cutting perpendicular, that is a nice 90-degree cut, to ensure that you're at a nice straight cut that is perpendicular, you make sure that when you, in this case here, this is a tri-square, you want to make sure that you put the tri-square between the teeth. If you hit a carbide tooth, you're not going to get an accurate reading. So make sure that you place the carbide, place the tri-square between the teeth when you're checking. Let's talk about some brief maintenance. From time to time, some rust might develop on this machine tabletop. In order to remove it, do not use solvent or gasoline. Do not use any type of silicone or type of spray. But to remove any kind of rust that's on here, you want to use a very fine grit silicon carbide sandpaper. Now, once that's done and you've taken off any kind of rust with that sandpaper, you can polish the tabletop. Don't use oil. The only thing appropriate that you would want to use for this tabletop would be some paste wax, some sort of wax that will create less friction on the top.